All the discussion going on recently about same-sex marriage, you hear a lot of people talk about what they call the biblical definition of marriage, which leaves some people being like, what you talking about, righty? The biblical definition of marriage is like, there isn't one. There's just like concubines and like people conquering cities and raping the girls and Solomon and 700 wives, and it's just stupid. The Bible says stupid stuff about marriage. And then there's people on the other side who are like, the Bible says that marriage is for one man and for one woman, and that's all there is to it. In any case, there's a lot of confusion about what the Bible actually says about marriage, and there's a lot of people, even really smart people, even people that I know and love and respect, that have been saying a lot of really stupid things about the biblical definition of marriage. So hopefully, we're going to clear that up today. What I will not be doing in this video, number one, I will not be talking about homosexuality really at all. Number two, I'm not going to say whether the biblical definition of marriage should have anything to do with our civil laws about marriage and civil unions and all that. Those are both great topics, and we're probably going to talk about them on this channel at some point, but just not today. So here we go. The biblical view of marriage, at least from a Christian perspective. First of all, not all Bible passages are created equal. We'll talk more about that in another video. Suffice to say that there are some things that are more important than others. Second, note that all the messed up ideas about marriage that we find in the Bible that people get upset about, they're all in the Old Testament. Now, that's not to say we don't use the Old Testament. We love the Old Testament, we appreciate it, and we read it, but from a Christian perspective, the Old Testament is all stepping stones that lead up to the New Testament. And so we read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. We don't read the Old Testament as like the final perfect word on anything. It's all leading us up to what Jesus has to say. Third, just because something happens in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible is cool with it. Saying that because there's people with multiple wives and people who capture women in battle and take them as their wives, that happens in the Bible and therefore the Bible must be cool with it. It's kind of like saying that the Bible's cool with crucifixion. Yes, it's in there. No, it's not okay. Fourth, of all the marriages in the Bible, and there are hundreds, let's be honest, I didn't count. I mean, who has time for that? There are only 14 that are really problematic. Let's go through them. I'll start with the ones you've never heard of. Lamech. He's in the book of Genesis right after Cain kills Abel, and Lamech is a terrible dude. He mocks God to his face after he kills a little kid, and the fact that he's got 2 wives is kind of supposed to show that he's a bad dude. The second guy you've never heard of is a guy named Elkanah. Him having 2 wives turns out to be really terrible and leads to all sorts of bitterness and jealousy and fighting amongst the wives. Next, there's 5 kings that nobody's heard of that I'm going to mispronounce. Rehoboam, Abijah, Joash, Jehoram, Jehoiakim. These guys are all kings in either the northern or southern kingdom. None of them is very important. The Bible doesn't even really say anything about whether them having more than one wife is good or bad. It just kind of says that they have them, but it's not much else other than that. Next guy's a guy named Belshazzar, and he's not even Jewish, he's Babylonian, so he doesn't really count for like what people in the Bible do because he's not even an Israelite. Next we get 2 guys you may have heard of, one named Gideon, who's a judge, and the judges are known for not being perfect people like Samson, so it's no surprise that he screws up. And the next is Ahab, who is generally regarded as the worst king of Israel ever. Next are the 4 really interesting ones because they're like heroes in the Bible. Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon. Abraham has a concubine, and this is one of the ones that people love to throw out and be like, well, you know, Abraham, he's supposed to be all faithful and stuff, he's the father of 3 faiths, and yet he has a concubine. But him going to his concubine is a disobedience. He's supposed to be trusting in God that God's going to give him a child, an heir with his wife Sarah. He and Sarah don't trust that, and so they do this thing with the concubine. Next we have Jacob, who's known for being a tricky, kind of morally sort of guy. He ends up with 2 wives because somebody tricks him into it. It's seen as a payback for what he's done to other people and how he's tricked other people. And just like with Elkanah, it ends up to a lot of jealousy and bitterness between the wives. The next one, maybe the most famous example, is David, who has several wives and also has an affair with Bathsheba. And that's seen as one of his great sins. David is seen as the best king, but it's not because he's perfect. It's because even when he fails, he always comes back to God. And finally, there's Solomon, who had like 700 wives and 300 concubines. But again, it says that the fact that he had those wives led him into bad places. It led him into idolatry. It's seen what caused his downfall. So it's hardly an endorsement. Long story short, of all the examples of people with multiple wives and concubines and all those sorts of things, not a single one of them is positive. Most of them are negative. Some of them are just kind of doesn't say anything about them one way or the other, but not one is positive. So if those are what the biblical view of marriage is not, then what is the biblical view of marriage? The foundational passages about marriage for a Christian that are in the Bible are found in the book of Genesis, specifically chapters 1, 2, and a little bit of 3. Genesis 1:27, where it says God created man and woman, he made them in his image and in his likeness. And implied in that is that there's something about the fact that we're made male and female that help us to understand the great mystery of God. It's not incidental that those two phrases, God made us in his image, he made us male and female, are right next to each other. There's something about being male and female that helps us to live in God's image. That's one of the ways that we're like God. That's a great mystery of the faith. Chapter 2 tells us the two purposes of marriage. One, for the companionship and love of the spouses, and number 2, for the procreation and raising of children. After God creates the first human, the first Adam, which means mankind, he notices that it's not good for the man to be alone, and he tries to make a partner suitable for him, and he makes all these animals, but none of the animals are suitable until finally he takes out of Adam's rib and makes a second. And then all of a sudden we no longer just have Adam, we now have male and female. Adam, the male now, sees the woman and says, "At last, this one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one's a suitable partner for me." And that gives us one of the purposes of marriage, the companionship, that we're meant to be together, that love, that bond between us. Right after that, God gives them the command to be fruitful and multiply, which gives us the second purpose of marriage, procreation and raising of children. It sums all this up at the end of chapter 2 in verse 24, where it says, "And this is why a man will leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and the two become one flesh." Yeah, I know, right? I always thought that came from that Spice Girls song. Don't listen to it. What we learn from all that, marriage is between man and woman, one of each. It's for the purposes of procreation and raising of children and the companionship of the spouses. That sex is a natural and good part of it, and that it's the foundation of the family. Also, something interesting in the very next chapter in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve's sin, God says that one of the consequences of their sin is that the man will now lord his authority over the woman, saying that something's not right anymore. There's no longer going to be this equality. In the beginning, there was meant to be this equality between man and woman. So that's also an essential part of marriage. Now, getting to the New Testament, there's a lot we could go into here, but I'm going to focus on two passages in Matthew 19, verses 1 to 12, where Jesus is talking about divorce. And guess what he quotes? He quotes Genesis 2:24, where a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one flesh. He affirms that vision in Genesis before the fall of man. Another key part here is that Jesus really emphasizes the forever part of it, that it's not meant to be broken, it's not meant to be divided. Later on in the New Testament, Paul's going to talk about marriage. His most famous passage about marriage is in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5, where he says that a wife is supposed to submit to the authority of her husband. And a lot of people get all up in arms about this and say, oh, it's sexist. But if they just read a few verses further, they would see that Paul also tells the husband that he's supposed to submit to his wife. And he sums it all up at the end by saying the husband and the wife are supposed to submit to each other. Again, affirming that equality between the sexes that was before sin entered the world. He's trying to get back to that. He also reinforces the idea that the husband-wife relationship is a great mystery that helps us to understand God and to live like God and live in God's image. Here's what we know. Marriage is between a man and a woman. They're to be committed for life. Marriage is the foundation of the family. Sex is a good and natural part of it. It's for the companionship of the spouses. It's also for the raising and begetting of children. And it's something mysterious and holy that helps us to understand the mystery of God's love and how we live in God's image. That is the biblical definition of marriage. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about marriage in general and also about the biblical definition of marriage, and I'd like to continue that discussion in the comments. So below, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about this. Specifically, what other Bible passages are important for you when talking about marriage, or ones that you have questions about or thoughts about. Also, I'd be fascinated to hear a Jewish perspective on this, because so many of the passages that we talked about today are from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. Also, just a reminder, in the comments, let's not get into the homosexuality discussion, just because that discussion tends to monopolize and take over, and also it's not really what we're talking about here. Also in comments, I'd be interested to hear what you think the best baby name of all the funny Old Testament names that we heard today would be. It's not enough Jehorims in the world today. I think I'd vote for Joash, because then when my son got in trouble, I could be like, ooh, Joash in trouble now. If you have questions about today's video or comments, or if you have suggestions for future videos, you can leave them in the comments or you can email us. Thanks for watching today, and God bless you.